Today I'm going to spend about 20 or 30 minutes and discuss the concept of infrastructure resilience and talk about some mitigation strategies to improve resilience in ways that we can measure resilience. If you want to go ahead and flip forward 2 slides, we're going to discuss a slide that has all the pictures on it. And so, as many of you know, there are 16 key areas that the United States recognizes as critical infrastructure. And these range anywhere from the commercial sector, finance, healthcare, water and wastewater systems, all sorts of things. The important thing to remember is that since this is such a broad area, it's really hard in this particular presentation to drill down into specific areas or specific technology. So we're going to cover just kind of a broad overview of what infrastructure resilience is, what it means. We're also going to talk a little bit about generally how we can use technologies and other sorts of methods to improve the resilience within these different areas. If you can go to the next slide, please, we'll spend a few minutes to talk about resilience. And so, as you can see on the slide, when we mention resilience, we're really talking about the ability to reduce the magnitude or the length of time and the disruption of an event. And on the next slide, we'll talk about what some of those events are. And it really hinges on whether or not a critical component of infrastructure has the ability to anticipate, absorb, or recover from a disruptive event. What makes it difficult is when we respond to an event, we have many different agencies. We have federal, state, local government that responds. We have private industry that's affected. We have private citizens that are affected. Everybody handles things differently. Everybody has a different amount of resources and different types of resources to respond. And each event is different. Even if you look at a hurricane may affect residents in New Orleans much different than it would affect residents on Long Island, as we have seen with Hurricane Katrina and Hurricane Sandy. We can see the differences there. So there's a lot of different factors to consider. And so, it really kind of depends on what the event is, the geographic location, who's in charge, who's responding, and what resources are available. So if you go to the next slide, please, we're going to talk about some of these events that we're often concerned with when it comes to resilience. So in terms of why we care, right? So as we discussed in a previous slide, resilience is basically the ability to bounce back or to decrease the amount of time of disruption when an event happens. And so some of the events that we're talking about are either natural or technological disasters, right? Hurricanes, tornadoes, major chemical facility disruptions, things like that. We can also talk about events that would involve terrorist activities or some other sort of sabotage. Physical security is a really big piece of protecting critical infrastructure, whether we're talking about securing the dam infrastructure, whether we're talking about making sure that chemical facilities are safe. Another area that we all probably have faced or have heard on the news at some time would just be the normal wear and tear, right? Things don't last forever. And we'll talk a little bit more about this later on in the presentation. But just the maintenance and the cost and the resources it takes to upkeep physical infrastructure, whether it's highways, railroads, tunnels, bridges, whatever it may be. It takes a lot of money. It takes a lot of people to inspect that infrastructure and to repair it. Things just wear out. Things become obsolete over time, right? So obsolescence is a big part of the infrastructure resilience and understanding how long something is going to be useful, right? If I install maybe a certain kind of material in a roadway, how long is that going to last? Is that going to last 10 years, 20 years? And it gets beyond that normal wear and tear because sometimes the technologies that we use do phase out. So a good example, you think about an iPhone. The iPhone has been around for, I think we just hit 10 years. But we're in the seventh iteration, right? But the apps that work on these newer models, right, actually won't work on a first generation iPhone anymore. They're just obsolete. The codes just don't match up. But it's only 10 years. So you think about the pace of technology and how things change. Things that may have been installed in the United States in certain critical infrastructure areas 10, 20 years ago may just not work with the technology that we have available now. So how do we keep up with that? How do we plan for reducing the amount of time before we have to actually upgrade something or change it out? And then the last thing I want to talk about, this is a type of security, cybersecurity, but specifically I want to mention hacking because it is such a big deal now. We have seen, worldwide, a lot of these sorts of threats. A few years ago, there was an attack on the Ukrainian power grid, looking at how that infrastructure was actually shut down through some uses of cyber intrusion. There's also been some instances in the United States where the Internet of Things, which is this interconnected network of devices, DVRs and refrigerators and all kinds of stuff, right? Where people have actually been able to hack into those and shut down parts of the internet. So imagine if you have a complex system like a nuclear power plant that's connected online. Obviously, that's part of a critical infrastructure of nuclear power. But if somebody were to get into that system, think of what they could do. So that's why all these different events are very important. And how do we prepare for this? Not just in the prevention to make sure these things don't happen, but also if they do happen, how do we recover from these quickly? So if you go to the next slide, we're going to talk a little bit about the disaster management cycle. It kind of puts into perspective how this cycle happens, different parts of events, and where we can kind of plug in and look at resilience in each of these different pieces of the cycle. So if you look, you have three arrows. It just kind of shows the flow between different events. You could easily take out all the red words that say post-disaster, pre-disaster, and disaster. You could put in event. So it's not just limited to a disaster. We're looking at any kind of event, right? Any kind of disruption. So resilience affects each one of these areas, right? We're thinking about ways that if you look at the pre-disaster or the pre-event phase, how do we have infrastructure in place? How do we have the right resources, the people, the education, the plans to be able to either prevent or minimize an event from happening altogether, right? Once an event does happen, let's say we were unable to prevent something, right? And then something happens. Well, then we have the actual impact of the disaster. With proper planning, with improvements in resilience, we can actually minimize the impact of that event. And then once that event is over, there's that recovery phase. There's the rebuilding phase, right? And again, the more improved the resilience is, the better prepared and better planned we are, if you will, the less likely we're going to have difficult recovery. We should have a shorter period of time to recover from this impact. So it's very important to think of resilience itself as a cycle, right? It's this kind of constant thing that undermines every point on this disaster management or this event management cycle, but it's something that we always have to have in place in the back of our minds. How are we going to get these things into place so that we can minimize not just the disaster from happening, but the impact and decrease the amount of time it would take to recover? So if you want to flip to the next slide, I'm going to take a break here for a second. That was just an overview of what we mean by resilience, of looking at critical infrastructure. Again, it's a very broad area, so we're just kind of touching the highlights, kind of touching just a very broad sense of what critical infrastructure resilience means and why it's such an impact that we have to be prepared for. If you want to go to the next slide, you'll see a list of several different things here, and we're going to walk through these for a few minutes. So this is kind of an overview of mitigation strategies that we can use to minimize the impact of an event or actually to improve resilience. So the first area that I want to talk about are technologies. So obviously the pace of technology development is rapidly increasing. We have a lot more tools to use, more available to our disposal than we ever had before. I think there's obviously a challenge in understanding how some of these technologies can be used and how they can be used better. Interestingly enough, some of you may have heard another presentation I gave a few months ago talking about some of the risk of these technologies. And it certainly is a double-edged sword. So a lot of the technologies on this list, looking at smart grid and looking at sensors, are obviously things that could potentially be used in terms of a cyber attack or something like that. There are ways to mitigate that in itself, and so that's probably a topic for another day. But today I just want to focus on using technologies to improve resilience, how we can enhance those. A lot of developments in nanotechnology have enabled sensors that can be developed at much smaller scales. It could be embedded into bridges and tunnels and things like that to measure the actual structural shifts and changes in building materials like concrete. You look at some of the advanced materials, and some of these can actually be what we call smart materials, where the material itself becomes a sensor, all right? And you can have these things connected to cloud-based networks where they're constantly sending signals, and you can see in real time how physical infrastructure would be changing. So imagine the amount of maintenance that could possibly reduce if you have improved materials, things that are stronger, things that are lighter. And also if you're able to monitor these things in real time, you can see the smallest of cracks of defects, and it would dramatically decrease the amount of inspectors or of maintenance crews that you would need. Because you can constantly monitor these things and have an idea of possible early concerns and get out there a lot early and fix a problem before it comes too worse. So I think it's something that probably could be a whole discussion in its own, but just to kind of put the issue out there. And there's another slide. The next slide we'll talk a little bit more about technologies and how they can be incorporated into an ecosystem. A little bit more that we can do is look at risk management, right? I know that many of you on the phone work with agencies who have developed risk management tools and frameworks for assessing and evaluating resilience. I'm going to talk about a couple that I think are good ways to kind of measure these. So we definitely have frameworks. We have assessments, as I mentioned, and then also there's this notion of community resilience. I'm going to spend a couple slides talking about that because coming from a public health background, it's a very important part of, a community, of a population, of not just having other people with policies, ready to respond to an event, but actually strengthening a community where an event could happen, right? How do we give that community the tools, the resources that they need to take care of themselves, to be sustainable, to give them some power to mitigate, the effects of an event. So I think that's a very important piece of infrastructure resilience, of mitigating infrastructure resilience. And in fact, it's kind of a trend that I've noticed has been popping up over the past, year or so. You see a lot more mentions of community resilience, but also in conjunction with the infrastructure resilience. And finally, the last two, they kind of go hand in hand in a way. The education, I think, once you learn how technologies can be used to improve resilience, once you understand the risk and you look at the measure of resilience, you can teach people about how they can incorporate those lessons into their communities or into policies, right? So not only teaching government officials or community leaders or researchers what are the gaps, what do we need, how do we fix that, but also how do we take that information, that knowledge, and that data, and we crunch it, and how do we get that into a policy that can either be codified into law or can be some sort of guideline that responders and leaders and managers, emergency managers, can actually follow. If you go to the next slide, you'll see a picture. It's a woman walking a dog in a very nice scene. This is a concept that we've been working on here for a while, and this is what I alluded to earlier. We have this ecosystem evolving advanced materials and technologies to kind of improve a community in a way. So basically, with the technologies available to us now, there have been many different reports from different agencies and companies and universities about how these different types of technologies can be used in communities and specifically in different types of infrastructure. But we're looking at new advances in nanotechnology. We can develop better coatings that are less resistant to different types of bacteria. So we're talking about reducing the likelihood of pandemics. We're also looking at ways that you can create more efficacious vaccines so you can protect the public's health in case there were some sort of fear of a pandemic. We're looking at sensors that can be placed in materials such as concrete to develop this integrated system where you would have a bridge that will constantly be sending back information that people could use to make decisions as to whether or not it was safe. Other types of building materials besides concrete. Concrete's the most commonly used probably in the world, but new advances in using nanomaterials in the concrete, but also carbon fiber and other sorts of things that are now being used to make components of bridges and dams and tunnels and things like that. So how is that going to impact the landscape in terms of minimizing maintenance, minimizing or extending the life of something? So if we go to the next slide, you should see a brief paragraph there on community resilience. So I want to spend the next few slides here in a few minutes talking about this specifically. As I mentioned, this is, I believe, an important part of improving the critical infrastructure resilience. It's a form of risk management in a way. But when we're talking about community resilience specifically, we're talking about a way to measure the sustainability of a community itself, right? Empowering them to utilize the available resources to respond to and recover from some kind of adverse event. And if you go to the next slide, this is, I think, a very good overview of how you actually plan for building a resilient community. And this is taken from NIST. I think this is a very good guide. NIST has several resources available for community resilience planning. There's a center that they've developed in conjunction with, I believe, the University of Colorado, looking at how do you do this, right? So as you kind of go down through the list, I want you to pay attention to numbers 4, 5, and 6, and you'll see the plan, right? Plan keeps coming up. I think almost every slide from here on out will have plan or planning in it. And just to kind of drive home the point, the very last slide, we'll also talk about planning, but planning is probably the most fundamental principle in improving resilience, whether you're talking about improving critical infrastructure resilience, or whether you're talking about community resilience, or whether you're talking about integrating the two, right? So many of you know you can never plan enough. And even if you plan enough, something is probably going to happen that you didn't plan for, right? But you'll be a lot better off than if we didn't plan and prepare at all. So when you look at community resilience, it's really a lot of teamwork, of planning, of understanding what situation you're trying to mitigate, how you have those reasonable goals and objectives to mitigate that, and then, of course, the planning, right? You develop the plan, you prepare it, and then you implement it. So if we go to the next slide, we'll talk a little bit about how we measure community resilience. And I think this is very important because this is how we set a benchmark, right? This is how we know how unprepared or how prepared we are for something, right? So this is some really interesting work, I think, from the first part about what you need to have in this resilient assessment, right? What are we trying to figure out? This comes from Gilbert. So it's a really good way for community leaders to know the level of resilience that they're currently facing in their community. And then also, if you have any kind of changes, how is that going to improve the resilience, right? How is that going to make a difference? The next thing I think is really interesting from Rentschler et al. This is the actual framework. So when you're developing some kind of measurements of resilience, right? What are the components that you need to have in there? And it's very catchy. They came up with something called People's Framework, right? The People's actually, it's convenient because that's what we're trying to help. We're trying to help the people, right? To prevent harm from them or minimize harm, but also it fits into the actual measures that we need to address. So we're looking at population, demographics, the environment, the government services, physical infrastructure, the lifestyle, economic development, and then that social and cultural capital, which is very important. So if you please turn to the next slide, you'll see like a big 6.7, and there's some purple boxes and things like that. So this is part of the National Health Security Preparedness Index. This was an initiative started by CDC several years ago. It is now in the hands of the Robert Wood Johnson Foundation, and they manage this index every year. So what this is basically is this is a measure of how well the United States is prepared to handle a health-related emergency. So I would definitely put this under a measure of community resilience within, possibly the larger critical infrastructure sector of healthcare. There's public health aspects to it. There are probably some other maybe commercial aspects and things like that. But primarily, we're looking at how well is the United States prepared in terms of the public health and healthcare infrastructure. And so overall, I think the high score is a 10. So we're rated a 6.7 right now on the 2015 score. There's more information you can drill down into. Each state has a score as well. And then there are these areas, you can see they call them preparedness by domain. So these different domains, health security surveillance, incident information management, and so forth. And each one of those has a score, but then it also has a subcategory underneath it. So I believe there are 70 or so measures that actually go into this index. But this is actually quite interesting. I had a chance to work on this several years ago, and it was a very good project to dig into, but to also understand like all of the different ways that we can measure just one thing, right? Health preparedness. That seems so simple, but it has such a widespread and wide-reaching audience. And so, if you look at something like this, obviously people who are government leaders, government officials, emergency managers, healthcare workers, right? These would be people who would be interested in understanding what are some things that we're lacking in, and how do we fix these, right? So this is what I was getting to earlier when, you have this measurement to tell you where you are, but then if you address these certain areas, how is that going to improve your resilience? If you go to the next slide, you will see at the top it has the infrastructure grades for 2013. So this is a scorecard, a report card actually, that's put out by the American Society of Civil Engineers. I believe it's every 3 years. I have to double check on that. I'm not exactly sure, but it's not annually. I think it's every 3 years or so. But basically what this is a score that the mainly physical, but critical infrastructure, if you will, the grade that the United States gets in each of these areas, and then overall. So if you look overall on the right-hand side, the GPA that the American Society of Civil Engineers has given the United States critical infrastructure is a D+, which many of you know, looking at the standard academic score, A being the best and F being the worst, we would all be below average students. So they also break it down and score each individual component of the infrastructure, right? So at the top there you see energy is a D+. You go down, you look at roads, they're a D. And then all the way at the bottom on the right, dams are a D. So we're not doing great. It looks like the best thing that we're doing in the solid waste, how we manage that. The point is, and this might be a sore subject with some people, we all kind of know where we stand with infrastructure, but the point is that this is a good measurement, a foundation, if you will, to see what areas could be improved. And if we, do an investment in a certain area, how is that going to affect, not just that area, but overall the whole infrastructure, critical infrastructure network, if you will. So if you'll go to the next slide, we're going to talk about Presidential Policy Directive, or PPD 21, for a few minutes. I know many of you are directly involved in this and supporting this policy. Some of you probably may not be involved directly, but definitely keep an eye on it. So what we're talking about here is something that's come out of the White House a few years ago, but we're talking about building a unified policy that helps to strengthen and maintain the resilience of critical infrastructure. And we've got these three imperatives, as they call it. But basically, this is these three strategic imperatives that cross the entire federal government in terms of how it wants to strengthen and approach infrastructure security and resilience. So the first imperative, the first point here is, kind of have this clarification of the functional relationships across federal government sectors, right? How do the different branches, how do the different agencies work together to share information, to share data, to possibly share research, or combine research efforts to improve and strengthen infrastructure resilience. The second point is, enabling the effective exchange of information. As we all know, when you get into multiple agency involvement and you look at different levels from local government all the way up to the federal government, and you include a private sector and others, it gets very complicated, right? There's always a lot of duplication of effort. There's things that get missed. There's things that get miscommunicated. So how do you streamline that communication? How do you make that more effective so that people are gathering the right information, people are sharing information, people aren't gathering things that somebody else already did, right? So how do we make that exchange better? And then the last point is, how do you implement, a way to analyze that and to improve, once again, the planning, right? It's so important. So how do we make that planning effort better, and how do we make decision making enhanced and much more effective? And we'll talk a little bit about, at the end, what HDI does, but this is something that we have done for Department of Defense. We, along with the other information analysis centers, we help facilitate research, we help collect information, we help retrieve information. So I think that this is an area that we may be able to help some of you kind of facilitate this exchange a little more. And if you want to go to the next slide, we're getting ready to wrap this up. So just some parting thoughts here. This is taken from a National Academy of Sciences report on the electric power delivery system response to terrorism and other natural disasters. But I think it's a very, very good quote to kind of wrap everything up. It's important to recognize the potential for lessons learned, which many of us know. And then above all, the participants of this workshop, they said that the most important thing was planning, right? The communication and action protocols are critical. So again, not to beat this to death, but planning is so important. We have to know where we currently are, and that comes back to gathering the right information, gathering the right data. That's where these frameworks for measuring resilience, where we currently are so important, where they come in handy. And then also having the foresight to know, well, what areas can we improve? Where do we have the resources? Where do we have the funding, the people, whatever that may be? And where can we reasonably and realistically go? And how do we get there, and what does that look like? And that's all part of planning. If you'll turn to the next slide, just briefly tell you a little bit about what HDIAC has available in terms of resources to assist you in your missions. So we offer a few different services. Some of you may know we are a Department of Defense funded center, along with two other information analysis centers. But one of the services that we do provide is a technical inquiry service. So if you have a question, if I've piqued your curiosity today, or if there's something that you hadn't thought about, maybe you want some answers, something that you're currently working on, updating a policy, or getting ready to start a research project, and there's a question that you may have, you can go to our website, you can submit a technical inquiry, and we will provide up to 4 free hours of analysis to provide some sort of answer to you. It has to fit within one of our 8 focus areas. Critical infrastructure protection is one of those areas, so we would definitely be able to handle any inquiries or questions you have about today's topic or anything else related, and anything in these 8 areas. For anything that's a lengthier project or that we just can't quite answer in those 4 hours for that technical inquiry, we do offer what's called a core analysis task. This is a pre-computed, pre-awarded contract vehicle. We've got 2 caveats that there is a cap of $500,000 on these projects, and they have to be completed within 1 year. But these are, small scale research projects, maybe a more detailed analysis of a topic. Again, if you're looking at revising a policy, if you're conducting some research, you need help collecting data, you need help analyzing that data, this is a good vehicle that we can assist you with. And if you want to go to the last slide there, that's my contact information. I'm available anytime. Feel free to call me up, shoot me an email. More than happy to answer any questions at any time. And for right now, I thank you for your time, and thanks again for allowing me to speak today, and I'm happy to take any questions.
Thank you, Greg. Okay, now we're going to move into our questions and answer portion of the telecon. I ask everyone, please check your individual phones and make sure that they're on mute. If you have a question, please state your name and your organization.
Conference is now in talk mode.
All right, do we have any questions out there?
Hi, this is Heather Nelson. I'm with ODNI. I'm not sure if any of my other ODNI colleagues are on the call, but I wanted to thank Greg very much for his briefing, and it's very timely, and certainly it's something that we're looking at across the USG. One of the things I wanted to ask is if he or anyone on the call is aware of the Joint Counterterrorism Assessment Team. This is something that at NCTC we work very closely with owners and operators of our critical infrastructure components, and we ask them to brainstorm what first responders would be able to do, and we provide what we call first responder toolboxes. So I would invite Greg or anyone else who would be interested to just look at some of those products. I can send the information to Meg for other people's awareness.
Yeah, Heather, thank you for bringing that up. I believe I was at the International Association of Emergency Managers conference last year, and I think there was a booth there for JCAT.
JCAT, that's right.
Yeah, and I was never aware of it before, so I'd be happy to take any information that you're willing to offer or any resources. It's an organization that I wasn't familiar with, and I really would like to know more of what they do and how we might be able to learn from them.
Excellent. Via Meg, thank you.
Okay, any other questions out there?
Hello?
Go ahead, please.
Hi, my name is Yan Yang. I'm a full professor at in the Department of Civil Engineering at the University of Illinois Urbana-Champaign. I'm not sure if some of my collaborators in ERDC Searle is there, but we are very interested in this topic that's introduced today. And then just from a sort of a curiosity point of view, so Greg today very nicely talked about the process to plan for community resilience. So planning obviously is very, very important. But also, can you elaborate a little bit about the response side and the recovery side? And then so how do you see the work being done to sort of when we get the imperfect information after the disasters or some impact, how do we dynamically update our decision-making process potentially? Just curiosity.
No, that's a great question, and thank you. So I think on the disaster management side, the responder side, it's an area that I've kind of just recently, kind of been exposed to. But I think a lot of it really comes into effective communication and education. And as you alluded to, how do we take the information that's been collected and gathered and kind of condense that into something that can then be transmitted out to the responder community that needs it. I know that over the past few years, there's been a push, a lot of it within academia, and I know funded by CDC, to look at disaster science. It's really an area that we haven't, as a country, collected a lot of data on how do we actually learn from disasters and events that we've responded to, and kind of look at lessons of the past and maybe some failures and also some victories, and how do we build on that into some sort of discipline in itself. So I think that educational aspect of it, of doing the research, of learning from previous responses, is important, and also communicating that. And I think that's an area that probably can be facilitated by some of these new technologies, tools like obviously social media. There's another project I worked on with the CDC called Operation Dragonfire, which was a method of, helping to facilitate communication. This is actually during an event, but it was a way to kind of get information out to people who needed it, and how do you do that effectively? So that's kind of where I see just continuing to use technologies to facilitate communication, and also I think improving maybe disaster science research.
Wonderful, thank you.
Thank you.
Okay, any other questions?
Yes, this is Larry Chalmer. Thank you, Mr. Nichols, for your presentation. I am a professor emeritus at National Defense University and also work with my local Fairfax County on what is called the Community Emergency Response Teams, which is part of the Fire and Rescue Organization. Meg, I welcome what the woman offered from ODNI, reference assessments, and I'll be in touch with you on that. And Greg, I will be back to you regarding community resilience and education. We are currently looking intently at future alterations to the manner of our training, and this is very much of interest and certainly very timely. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Larry. I appreciate that.
Okay, any other questions? Oh, I can barely hear you. Can you speak up, please?
Yes. Hi, Mariah Yeager. And I have a question about the data that you guys were using. Did you have access on the geospatial data?
I'm sorry, I couldn't hear you very well. It was very faint.
Oh, sorry about that. Is this any better?
A little bit, yeah.
I was asking about the data that you guys provided for your services. Do you look for geospatial data, or are you limited to other areas?
That's a good question. This presentation didn't actually have any, unique research that we've conducted here recently. This is just kind of a compilation of different sources. However, there are some projects where we have used geospatial data and work with some other government agencies. So, it's something that we could do, and obviously it's very possible to incorporate that type of data into any sort of disaster response or resilient research. If that answers your question.
Any other questions?
Hello, Megan, you there?
Yes, go ahead, please.
Yeah, Megan, I'll cook from Joint Staff J6 for Greg. In your analyses, have you come across any cater systems that you see that really work well? Over.
I'm sorry, could you repeat that?
Yeah, Greg, during the analyses of these resilience and disasters, have you come across any cater systems, humanitarian systems, disaster relief systems in your studies that you feel are real good systems? Over.
Oh, thank you very much. Not in this particular research for this presentation. There's been some projects I worked with in the past, and I'll have to go back and refresh my memory on some of those systems. But maybe this is an opportunity for us to connect at a later time, if that would be okay with you, and we can talk about that.
Definitely, I got your email address, and I'll get back in touch with you then. Thanks a lot, Greg.
Okay, that sounds good. Thank you.
Greg, have you been? Are you familiar with the Pacific Disaster Center?
Yes, actually, I am from a previous life.
Okay. So, yeah, I'll get in touch with you then.
Okay.
Thank you.
That sounds good. Thank you.
Any more questions? All right, well, if there's no more questions, I want to thank everyone for dialing in. And a special thanks to Greg for taking the time out of his day to brief us. So thank you very much, Greg.
Thank you, Beck, for having me. Appreciate it.